Hi, we continue our journey through Genesis with one of the strangest little passages, not only in Genesis, but in the entire Bible, Genesis 6, 1-4. You can see those verses on the screen, and I'm going to go over them in just a moment. But you see on the right side of the screen, and that's what we're going to do in this video, are questions raised by these 4 verses. So there's so much going on, and if it seems obscure in a way that doesn't matter to you, well, go on to something else. But I hope you'll find that by the time we're done with this video and the next one, these verses are actually crucial to understanding not only the perspective of Genesis in relation to power and violence and God, but also to the New Testament as well in a surprising way. So I hope you'll bear with the obscurity of it so we could try to shed some light on it from the work of scholarship and our own explorations here. So let's just listen a little bit first to these 4 verses, and then we'll look at the list of questions. When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair. They took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. What are these 4 verses? As you can see, they follow directly after the end of chapter 5 with the Toledot of Adam, as we've saw in the last few videos, with the description of Noah living 500 years and becoming the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which we looked at in the last video. And suddenly these 4 verses, and then as you can see below, starting in verse 5, we have a shift to Yahweh, or the Lord saw the wickedness of humankind was great, and we see the setup for the flood story, which follows in a few verses. So scholars, really since before there was a Bible, readers have struggled with these verses. And not only they struggle with them, they've been inspired by them in ways that are perhaps surprising to us. As we'll see before we're done today, an entire book of Enoch was developed out of the passage that we saw 2 times ago in 524 about Enoch having been taken by God, who then in the tradition in 1st Enoch becomes a visionary for texts that begin with midrashic version of this very passage we see here, which we'll look at a little bit today. But also we see in verse 4 the Nephilim, who have spawned imitations in video games and books and TV and all kinds of cultural phenomena right now in this current moment. So a lot of things that here have led people's imaginations to be opened wide up. So let's begin to just look at some of the questions that are raised by these, and then next video I'll try to offer some responses to some of these questions. So immediately, as you can see on the right side, how are these verses connected with the book of the Toledot of Adam in Genesis 5? If I scroll back up, it's not at all clear. As we can see, we had the whole list of the names and the pattern that we looked at, and obviously, one way to look at that is it's from a different author. That's something we'll consider next time. Or is it integrated directly into this passage? And we'll see that there's evidence for both, which is why it's an ongoing question rather than something that scholars have figured out and provided at least a momentarily settled answer for. Looking a little farther back, what's the relationship between what we see here in these verses and the Garden of Eden story? There are 2 particular things to draw attention to, and I'll just draw attention to them now, and we'll look at them next time. So we see here in verse 2, it says, The sons of God saw that they were fair, although the Hebrew here is tovath, or good, tov, and they took wives for themselves of all they chose. So we see 3 concepts in sequence. The sons of God saw that something was tov, good or fair, and they took. But then back in chapter 3, verse 6, we heard this. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a light to the eyes, and the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave some to her man who was with her, and he ate. So a rare combination of seeing something as good and taking, and also a rare combination, as you can see on my list of questions, between what follows in 6:3 and what follows a little later in the Garden of Eden story in 3:22. So we hear here in 6:3, Then Yahweh said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they were flesh, their days shall be 120 years. And we hear in 3:22, Then Yahweh God said, See, the Adam has become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So in both of them, there's a divine response of some kind of caution, if not a punishment, at least some kind of limitation in response to this seeing something was good and taking. So we'll have to explore what the relationship is there. The phrase "son of God," sons of God, as you see here, and you can see in my note a number of things, is B'nai Ha-Elohim. And one of the questions is, what does that mean? You see in the New Revised Standard, sons of capital G God, but it could also be sons of the gods, because Elohim is generically a plural word. But Elohim, as we saw in the translations in the very first verses of chapter 1, it also could be an adjective of power. So is it the characteristic of these sons that they are of God or the gods, or is it they're just mighty? In the same way that we saw Ruach Elohim, is that a wind from God or a mighty wind hovering over the waters back in the first 2 verses of Genesis? So that's a question we'll have to look at. And once we decided what to translate it, what are they? The word sons of God doesn't make it evident, especially to modern readers, of who they are. It certainly doesn't make it evident from readers of Genesis 1 to 5. There's no sense that there was anything created in chapter 1 or in the Garden of Eden story that corresponds to sons of God, which again is what leads some scholars to see this section as from a different source, or a chunk from a missing mythology that we've never found. That's all speculation, of course. But there certainly seem to be connections with the Garden of Eden story. So if people know the Garden of Eden story, you would think they would know that there had been no description of anything like sons of God having been made, but here they are. So what are they? And as you can see in the options in number 4 on the right side, are they other gods from a time before the authors were completely monotheistic? There are examples of that we'll explore. Are they, as was interpreted in the oldest interpretation of this in the book of First Enoch, the so-called Book of the Watchers, that introduces the larger collection of First Enoch? Are they angels, or as they call their watchers? Are they, as later Christian interpreters in the early Christian years, interpreted as descendants of Seth as opposed to descendants of Cain? Or are they, as George Nicholsburg interprets the meaning of them in First Enoch, as opposed to their meaning here in Genesis 6, as powerful humans like kings or judges? And some scholars have seen it even in the Genesis context, apart from First Enoch, that way. So we'll have to come back to that question as well. So continuing on here. What is it exactly that the B'nai Ha-Elohim see when looking at the human women? The New RSV has fair here, but scholars have argued at great length, including as recently as long journal articles from 2020, so a current argument, not one from the distant past, whether this means they're fair or beautiful, or they're good. And one of the questions is, can you see that something's good, or can you just see that they're beautiful? But there are some interesting issues to look at there, of whether they're attracted to beauty or attracted to goodness there. So we'll have to come back to that one as well. And is this taking meant to be something critical? Is it meant to be like what kings do in 1 Samuel 8, in the sense of taking, in the sense of raping or taking without consent? Or is it simply the act of marrying? Partnering up and having children, which certainly to be fruitful and multiply, as we see in verse 1, and of course echoing what we saw earlier in Genesis 1, would seem to be the divine imperative, to find partners and to multiply and have children, but it could be read positively or negatively. Then looking within our passage here, verses 1 and 2 seem to fit together. They're like one sentence there, with the initial clause in verse 1 and the consequences in verse 2. But what's the relationship with verse 3? How does it follow that Yahweh said, "My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever," given something that the sons of God did and that apparently humans have nothing to do with? Is this a punishment? And if so, why would it be a punishment against humans rather than a punishment against the sons of God, which isn't named at all there? So there's a real question of whether verse 3 fits with verse 2 or it's something else. Also in verse 3, Yahweh says, "My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh." But we saw in the Yahwist or J text, or as scholars now like to say non-P text in chapter 2, verse 7, that God breathed God's spirit into the topsoil, into the Adamah, and it became a living being, a nephesh. It wasn't described there as basar, which is what flesh is here, but as a nephesh, a living being consisting of spirit and flesh. So what might it mean here that they are flesh as opposed to they are flesh and spirit? We'll have to come back to that one as well. Also, while we're in verse 3, their days shall be 120 years. What does that mean when we know that later in Genesis, Abraham will live to be 175, and his descendant Isaac 180, and his descendant Jacob 147? It's actually Moses who lives to be exactly 120, but is that what's involved here? Or does it refer to something else? As some ancient rabbis have suggested, not a length of time for humans, but the length of time before the flood started. So not a human lifespan individually, but a lifespan of humanity before the flood is another possibility. We'll have to come back to that one as well. And there's more. Who are these Nephilim who we see in verse 4 that were on the earth in those days and also afterward? Which times are being distinguished? Is that before the flood and after the flood? Maybe. Well, why Nephilim? Notice it's not translated here. This is just literally what the Hebrew says. But the Septuagint in the Greek, it has gigantes, or giants. So do we understand them as giants? Or do we understand from the Hebrew root Nephal, meaning to fall, thus fallen ones? Contrasting, as we'll see, with Enoch, who is taken up from earth to God, and here the Nephilim, if they're fallen ones, come down from the sky or the divine realm onto the earth realm. We'll look at that some more next time. Are these a hybrid, or are the combination of some divine and human things, and what would that mean there? And then you see also in verse 4, children who bore children to them, who are the heroes of old warriors of renown. What are those children? In other words, are the Nephilim just another term for the sons of God, or are they something else? And Nephilim, as you can see from a brief look here's Nephilim, the rock band. Here's Nephilim from the Magic the Gathering card game. Here's Nephilim from the classic TV show X-Files. Here's Nephilim from the video game Darksiders. And finally, here's Nephilim from the book series and TV show Shadowhunters. So Nephilim have certainly captured the imagination of many cultural creators, both in the ancient world and the first Enoch, but also in our moment right now. So we're going to have to explore a lot about who are these Nephilim, and how are they related to the people a little later in Genesis we see in the Nimrod people, because here, as you can see, they're described in the Greek as giants, but later on here in the verse we see they're described as Gibborim Asher Me'olam, heroes as of old. But let's listen briefly to 10:8, and we hear this. Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior, in the Hebrew Gibbor, in the Greek Gigos, giants. He was a mighty hunter in the Hebrew Gibbor Said, and in the Greek Gigos Kunigos, a rare word only here, and it's parallel in 1 Chronicles 1-10. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter, again, Hebrew Gibbor, and in Greek Gigos Kunigos. Notice that the Greek is conflating what in Hebrew is Gibbor or Gibbor Said, hunter or warrior, as one word. So are we to follow the Greek and see these as giants? If we see them as giants, how are they related to the Raphaim in Deuteronomy 3:11, or the Nephilim in Numbers 13:33, as we see here? There we saw the Nephilim, the Anakites, come from the Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them, certainly implying that they were large. But other than large, what do we know about them? So these Nephilim, and why Genesis is focused on them, given they're only mentioned in Numbers and never else again. They've certainly captured a lot of imagination for a reference that's so rare in the Hebrew Bible. And then finally, how are these verses understood in later Jewish texts, especially the Jewish texts that came out before the New Testament got a hold of it, like the collection known as First Enoch? And I want to show us a little of that so we can get a glimpse of what's going on there. And we'll look more at this next time. We recall that Enoch was said to be taken, and that leads to this in these opening verses of this long collection. Enoch, a righteous man whose eyes were opened by God, saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angel showed me, and from them I heard everything, and from them I understood as I saw, not for this generation, but for a remote one which is for to come. And so That's the announcement that Enoch, having been taken up, is now going to be given by God a vision for a future time, that future time not named. A little later on, and curiously, it's in chapter 6, the first verses of Enoch, just like it is in Genesis. They don't otherwise follow. And we hear how similar this is to the text on the left side of the screen. And when the sons of men had multiplied in those days, beautiful and comely daughters were born to them, and the watchers, or angels, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said to one another, Come, let us choose for ourselves wives from the daughters of men, and let us beget for ourselves children. So you see it's taking up Genesis 6, 1-2, but expanding it. And then in the next chapter, which is really just a couple of verses down in 1 Enoch, this expansion. It's worth listening to this so you can hear the direction that 1 Enoch is going and interpreting this whole unit. These and all the others with them took for themselves wives from among them such as they chose, and they began to go into them and to defile themselves through them, and to teach them sorcery and charms, and to reveal them the cutting of roots and plants. So none of that, of course, is in Genesis. And they conceived from them and bore to them great giants, and the giants begat Nephilim, and to the Nephilim were born Eliud, a term which is obscure even to the now late but world's expert on 1 Enoch, George Nicholsburg. They were devouring the labor of all the sons of men, and men were not able to supply them. And the giants began to kill men and to devour them. And they began to sin against the birds and beasts and creeping things and the fish, and to devour one another's flesh. And they drank the blood. Then the earth brought accusation against the lawless ones. And as we'll see, that's really connecting the verses that follow in Genesis 6, where the earth is deemed corrupt, and that will lead to the flood. So First Enoch is taking up these verses and those that follow, even though scholars would argue that perhaps Genesis 6, 5-8 come from a different source than 6, 1-4 that we're looking at now. But by the time of First Enoch, perhaps in the 2nd century BCE, this was all integrated together. So we're going to have to look a little bit at that, although I'm not going to explore the details of 1 Enoch, which is an apocalyptic text, again, very important to the New Testament understanding of Jesus, but beyond the scope of this particular series on Genesis, where we go down a deep rabbit hole there. But I will mention it next time. Similarly, the book of Jubilee is another apocalyptic intertestamental Jewish work concerned with calendar as an instrument of imperial authority, and it also has its own little commentary on this scene. We won't look at that one, though. We'll just look at the first Enoch one. And then the Rabbinic Midrash, which is the latest of all these, in the several centuries later into the Common Era, collected in Genesis Rabbah in the 5th century CE, but certainly written earlier, where they have their own takes on this. So just going over the questions took us the length of one of our usual videos. So I hope you'll come back to see, at least if not answers, at least to enter more deeply into some of these questions that expand out from this handful of verses that turn our story toward the flood. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.